Chapter 1. The Note Buried in Her Palm. It was one of those rare October evenings when the air in London seemed touched with a strange clarity, a crisp stillness that made the city's lamps glow brighter and the cobblestones gleam as though newly polished. Hastings and I had just returned from a modest dinner near the Strand, the sort of meal that, in Poirot's view, was agreeable only because it provided the opportunity for precise observation of other diners. He had been in unusually contemplative spirits, watching a pair of strangers at the far table with the air of a man mentally assembling a chess puzzle. Our cab had scarcely drawn up to my lodgings when a motor car slid sharply to a halt behind us. A uniformed chauffeur leapt down, followed by a woman in evening dress whose pale face was illuminated by the street lamp as she hurried towards us. She moved with urgency, yet carried herself with the rigid grace of someone schooled to conceal distress. "Monsieur Poirot?" Her voice was low but tremulous. "You must come at once. There has been a terrible incident." Poirot inclined his head, offering the faintest of bows. "Madam, I am at your service. But tell me, what nature of incident compels such haste?" Her eyes flickered, as if she weighed whether to speak the words aloud in the open street. "It is my cousin, Miss Evelyn Harcourt. She was found dead in the conservatory of our home an hour ago. The police believe it was natural causes. But She stopped, swallowed hard, and lowered her voice. "I believe she was murdered." The last word carried no tremor of melodrama, only a flat conviction that made me draw a sharp breath. Poirot's gaze sharpened instantly. "And why, madam, do you think so?" She glanced about and in a quick, almost furtive movement, produced a small square of paper from her evening bag. It was folded so tightly that its creases cut deep, and as she placed it into Poirot's hand, I caught sight of faint smudges, as if someone had clutched it in desperate haste. "She was holding this," the woman whispered, "clutched in her palm when they found her. I saw it before the police arrived. I took it. They mustn't know." "Not yet." Poirot, with infinite care, unfolded the paper. Inside, written in an uneven hand, were 6 words: "He knows." "Before midnight. Burn it." The words, though sparse, seemed to hum with menace in the quiet night air. Poirot studied them for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. "You did well, madam," he said softly. "But the why of it, that is the heart of the affair, is it not?" She nodded. "Please, will you come to Harcourt House? I will tell you everything on the way." Within minutes, we were seated in the deep leather of the motor car's rear seat, the lamps of the city receding into a blur. The woman introduced herself as Mrs. Lucinda Markham, widow and cousin to the deceased. Evelyn Harcourt, she explained, had been in excellent health, a woman of sharp intellect and independent means, though not without her share of family tensions. Tonight, the Harcourts had hosted a dinner party, 8 guests in total, all staying in the house overnight. It was during the final course that Evelyn excused herself, Mrs. Markham said. She never returned. They found her in the conservatory, slumped on the chaise near the ferns. Her voice caught. The doctor said heart failure. But I saw her hand, her fingers tight, as if she were still holding on to something. When I prized them open, she gestured faintly toward Poirot's pocket, where the note now lay. That was inside. Poirot listened in complete stillness, his fingertips pressed together, eyes half-lidded, as though he were assembling a pattern invisible to the rest of us. "Tell me, madam," he said at last, "who are these guests that share the house tonight?" "Family, mostly. My brother, Mr. Alistair Greaves. My stepdaughter, Julia. Evelyn's solicitor, Mr. Peter Latham, and his wife. And 2 friends of Evelyn's from her days in Paris. Mademoiselle Sabine Duval and her companion, a young man named Charles Everley. Oh, and Colonel Dane, an old friend of my late husband. That makes 8 with myself." "A closed circle, Hastings," Poirot murmured, "like the petals of a flower in which a worm hides." When we reached Harcourt House, a sprawling Georgian residence set back from the road, the hour was late, but the lights blazed in nearly every window. A uniformed constable stood by the door, noting our arrival with a wary eye, though Mrs. Markham's brisk introduction seemed to smooth our passage. Inside, the house had that uneasy hush particular to places where tragedy has only just occurred. Servants moved silently at the edges of the hall. The The guests, it seemed, had retreated to their rooms, though faint murmurs of voices reached us from the upper landing. Mrs. Markham led us at once to the conservatory. The scent of damp earth and hothouse blooms hung in the air. The chaise, draped in pale upholstery, still bore the faint indentation where Evelyn had lain. Beside it, on a small wicker table, sat a glass containing a pale residue of liquid. Poirot stepped forward, examining the scene with the intensity of a jeweler inspecting a flawed diamond. He moved without haste, yet nothing escaped his notice. The arrangement of cushions, a faint smudge on the edge of the glass, the slight disarray of a fern frond as though brushed by a passing sleeve. "The police," he murmured, "are sometimes too hasty in their conclusions. Heart failure, yes? But I see here the suggestion of something more deliberate." He turned to Mrs. Markham. "Madam, you will do nothing, you understand, to alert the others that I am investigating. Let them believe me merely a friend, here to offer comfort. We shall observe them in their natural state." Her eyes widened. "You believe it was murder, then?" Poirot's smile was faint but certain. "I believe, madam, that the dead do not clench messages in their hands by accident. And I believe also that someone in this house, even now, is praying that note remains unread." He glanced toward the door, where shadows shifted just out of sight, and his voice dropped. "Come, Hastings, we have work to do. The truth, she is here in this house. All that remains is to coax her into the light." Chapter 2, The First Clues. Poirot began his work in the conservatory with the air of a man who had all the time in the world. He moved from the chaise to the little wicker table, pausing now and again to draw from his pocket a small magnifying lens, which he wielded as though he were a surgeon and the scene before him a delicate operation. Meanwhile, tried to keep my thoughts on the practical, the note in Evelyn Harcourt's palm, the curious wording, and the fact that 8 guests, all known to each other, were present under this roof. It was too neatly enclosed for my liking. The pale residue in the glass caught Poirot's eye first. He tilted it gently, peering at the rim. "Lipstick," he murmured. "A color not currently worn by our poor Mademoiselle Harcourt." His fingertip indicated a faint smear, hardly visible in the muted light from the conservatory lamps. "And yet, Hastings, we must not leap to the conclusion that it is from another. The glass may have been used before, yes? But in my experience, such small errors are the seeds of truth." He moved onto the floor beneath the chaise. The patterned tiles were spotless, save for a solitary petal bruised at the edges. He stooped, examined it closely, and smiled in that infuriatingly satisfied way that told me he had already stored away in his mental filing cabinet. "Do you observe, mon ami, how the petal has been crushed from above, not fallen gently? This tells us of movement here, swift movement, at the time of death." I frowned, casting my eyes about. The place was a riot of hothouse plants, tall palms, trailing vines, and the glass walls slick with condensation. "You mean someone was standing here?" "Standing, kneeling, bending. There are many ways to crush a petal, Hastings. We do not yet know which is the correct one." He straightened and turned his attention to the fern near the chaise. One frond hung limply, its tip bent as though recently disturbed. Poirot traced the arc with a fingertip. "A sleeve brushed here," he said softly. "Long, heavy cloth, perhaps velvet or brocade. It was not Mademoiselle Harcourt's gown, I think." At that moment, the conservatory door opened, and Mrs. Markham stepped inside with a young maid in tow. The girl's eyes were wide, and she seemed half reluctant to cross the threshold. "This is Clara, Monsieur Poirot," Mrs. Markham explained. She was among the first to find her. Poirot turned to the girl with grave courtesy. "Mademoiselle Clara, I am most grateful for your assistance. You came into this room when—" "Just after the first course, sir. Miss Evelyn wasn't in her place, and Mrs. Markham asked me to check the rooms. I found her here." "You touched nothing?" "No, sir." "Well," she hesitated, "only her hand. I thought she might wake if I took it, but she was cold. And this glass—" Poirot gestured. "I saw it there when I came in, sir. I didn't notice if she had been drinking from it." Poirot inclined his head. "And the door to the garden, was it locked?" Clara shook her head. "It was ajar. Just a crack, like someone had been out. The girl's account, though simply told, brought a flicker of intensity to Poirot's eyes. Merci, mademoiselle. You have been most helpful. That will be all. When she had gone, I said quietly, You think someone came in from the garden? Poirot's shoulders lifted in the smallest shrug. Perhaps Hastings. Or perhaps someone wished it to seem so. A door left open. It is like a curtain in a play. One must ask whether it was left that way for effect. We left the conservatory for the adjoining morning room, which the police had used briefly as their staging area. On a writing desk near the window, Poirot paused, his gaze fixed on a slim notepad. He tore away the top sheet, revealing the faint impression of words written on the page beneath. Producing a small pencil from his waistcoat, he shaded lightly across the paper until the ghost of a message emerged. 10:45. Bring it to me directly. See. Poirot's expression was unreadable. The hour is interesting, Hastings. Miss Harcourt was discovered shortly before 11. This note, perhaps, was written to her or by her. See. I asked. He tapped his nose. We do not guess until we must. Mrs. Markham, who had remained silent until now, spoke in a low tone. Monsieur Poirot, you must understand, the people in this house tonight, they are not all friends of one another. There have been quarrels, resentments. Evelyn was private about her affairs, but there were whispers of a matter she intended to announce soon. An announcement? Poirot's head turned sharply. Yes, she had hinted to me, only yesterday, that she was changing her will. She did not say in whose favor. The silence between us lengthened. Poirot's gaze drifted toward the ceiling, where faint footsteps moved along the upper corridor. A change of will, and the day before her death. Mon Dieu, Hastings, could the timing be more perfect for the hand that is greedy? Before we could press Mrs. Markham further, a tall man in his 50s appeared in the doorway. His hair was silver, his stance military. Lucinda, he said briskly, what is all this, and who are these gentlemen? This is Monsieur Hercule Poirot, Mrs. Markham replied. He is here to help. The man's eyes flicked over Poirot, then to me, with a mixture of suspicion and challenge. Alistair Greaves, Evelyn's cousin, like Lucinda. And I'll say frankly, I don't think dragging in outsiders will help matters. The doctor was clear enough. Heart failure. Poirot's bow was exquisite. Monsieur, I am content to let the facts speak. But sometimes the facts, they are shy. They require coaxing. Greaves muttered something under his breath and withdrew, his tread heavy on the polished floor. Poirot watched him go, his brows knitting. An impatient man, that one, Poirot murmured. Impatience, Hastings, is sometimes a child of fear. We returned to the conservatory once more, for Poirot insisted on a final sweep before retiring. This time, he crouched near the chaise and reached beneath it. When his hand emerged, it held a tiny object between thumb and forefinger. A pearl earring, its clasp bent. Not Miss Harcourt's, Mrs. Markham said at once. She never wore pearls. Poirot slipped it into an envelope. Then, madam, it must belong to someone else. Someone who leaned close to our poor mademoiselle, close enough to lose at the moment when all was ending. He straightened, his eyes alight. Come, Hastings. We have the first threads. Now we must see to whom they lead. Chapter 3. The Gathering of Suspects. It was decided, at Poirot's suggestion, all those present in Harcourt House should assemble in the drawing-room before the night grew any later. Mrs. Markham made the request with what I thought admirable calm, though I noticed a slight tightening of her fingers about the arm of the settee as we waited. One by one they arrived, like pieces on a chessboard being set in place. First came Alistair Greaves, his earlier irritation not lessened by the summons. He took up a position by the mantel, hands clasped behind his back, and fixed his gaze on the embers as though he might outstare the fire into submission. His stance had the rigidity of a man accustomed to command, though it struck me as somewhat forced, as if the certainty behind it were brittle. Julia Greaves followed, Alistair's stepdaughter. She was a young woman of perhaps 25, striking rather than pretty, with an air of quiet watchfulness. Her dark hair was coiled neatly at the nape of her neck, and her eyes, gray, cool, and keen, took in the room as though weighing its occupants. She greeted no one directly, but sank into a chair near the window. Then entered Mr. Peter Latham, Evelyn's solicitor, a spare man with a thin mustache in a precise manner, accompanied by his wife, Caroline. Caroline Latham was the sort of woman one might imagine presiding over village fetes. Plump, cheerfully dressed, but with eyes that flitted too quickly from face to face, betraying an underlying restlessness. Mademoiselle Sabine Duval swept in next, her gown a rich violet that caught the light with each movement. Her perfume, something floral and faintly exotic, drifted ahead of her. She was French, with the poise of a woman accustomed to admiration, though the faint smudge beneath her eyes suggested recent tears, or perhaps lack of sleep. At her side was Charles Everly, a young man of handsome, careless aspect, whose smile seemed intended for everyone and no one in particular. Last came Colonel Dane, a broad-shouldered figure, with a square jaw and an expression that hinted at a permanent mild annoyance with the world. He saluted Mrs. Markham briefly, before lowering himself into a chair with the creak of leather. Poirot stood by the hearth, his hands neatly folded over his waistcoat. "Mesdames, Messieurs," he began, "I thank you for your indulgence at this late hour. I have been asked by Mrs. Markham to make certain inquiries regarding the most distressing death of Miss Evelyn Harcourt. For the present, I am but a friend of the family, here to listen. You will find me, I think, very discreet." No one spoke, though I observed a flicker of unease pass over more than one face. Poirot continued in that measured tone of his. "It would be of service to me if each of you might speak briefly as to your movements this evening, purely to ensure that I have the sequence of events correct in my little gray cells." Alistair Greaves was first. "We dined at 8, he said briskly. "I remained at table the entire time, except to step into the hall once to speak with Carson, the butler, about the port. Evelyn excused herself toward the end of the main course. I assumed she'd gone to make some private call." "Merci, monsieur," Poirot said mildly, though I noticed he made a small note in his pocketbook. Julia's voice, when she spoke, was low and even. I left the dining room briefly myself, perhaps 10 minutes after Evelyn, only to fetch a book from the library. I didn't see her. Peter Latham cleared his throat. We remained at table until Mrs. Markham's maid came to say Miss Harcourt was unwell. I went with Colonel Dane to conservatory, but by then he spread his hands. It was too late. Caroline Latham interjected. "I didn't even know she'd left the room. She seemed perfectly fine all evening, quiet, but that was Evelyn." Poirot inclined his head and turned to Mademoiselle Duval, who toyed with a silver bracelet as she spoke. I excused myself to the ladies' room after the fish course. I passed the conservatory doors, but they were closed. I thought nothing of it. I did not see Evelyn until she trailed off, shivering slightly. Charles Everly's account was delivered with a casualness I found faintly irritating. I stayed in the dining room, chatting with Mrs. Latham. I've barely been here a day, arrived from Paris yesterday, so I hardly know the household comings and goings. Colonel Dane, in contrast, was brisk, sat through dinner, went to the library afterward to fetch the evening paper. Didn't see Miss Harcourt. It was a tidy sequence on the surface, yet I sensed Poirot's mind turning over the small asides, the gaps in time that each account left unfilled. He asked no probing questions, yet, instead, he changed the subject with apparent ease. Miss Harcourt, he said lightly, was, I understand, a woman of some determination. Did she share with any of you certain plans she had for the future? There was a subtle shift in the air. Mademoiselle Duval glanced down. Julia's eyes narrowed slightly. Alistair Greaves spoke first. Evelyn was private. If she had plans, she kept them to herself. I heard, Caroline Latham said in a hesitant voice, that she was making some sort of announcement soon. That's all. And I, Colonel Dane put in, heard nothing of the sort. Poirot nodded, as though such variance in knowledge were perfectly natural. One last matter. This evening, did any among you go into the garden? There was a pause. Charles Everly gave an easy shrug. I stepped out for a cigarette between courses. The air in the dining room was a bit close. Didn't go near the conservatory, though. Mademoiselle Duval's lips parted, as if to speak, but she closed them again and looked away. Poirot did not press. Instead, he gave a courteous bow. Merci, Mes Amos. I shall trouble you no further tonight. Tomorrow, perhaps we may talk again, individually. But for now, rest. The night, she can bring clarity. As they filed out, I noted the small frictions between them. Julia and Charles passing without acknowledgement, Mademoiselle Duval pausing to speak quietly to Mrs. Markham, Colonel Dane giving a curt nod to no one in particular. When the room was empty save for us, Poirot turned to me with that cat-like look of his. You see, Hastings, already there are patterns. The timing of departures from the table, the little overlaps, the garden door. We are building a tapestry. Soon, perhaps, the picture will begin to show itself. He patted his pocket with a folded note lay. And when it does, mon ami, we shall see whose name is stitched at the very center. Chapter 4. Poirot observes. The morning after Miss Harcourt's death broke cold and bright, the light flooding through Harcourt House's tall windows with a clarity that seemed almost at odds with the heaviness of the previous night. I rose early, but Poirot was already awake, immaculately dressed, and seated at a small table in the guest chamber, sipping chocolate with the deliberate slowness of a man whose mind was busy elsewhere. Today, Hastings, he said, we shall take the temperature of the household. Not with a thermometer, but with the eyes and the ears. One must watch how grief behaves, or pretends to behave, when it thinks it is not under scrutiny. Breakfast was served in the smaller dining room, and Poirot insisted we take a place slightly apart from the others, where we might see without being in the center of conversation. The guests filed in one by one, each offering some polite variation of good morning, yet carrying with them the faint shadow of strain. Alistair Greaves entered first, already dressed for the outdoors, a heavy coat over his arm. His manner was brisk, but there was a restless energy in the way he shifted his coffee cup from one hand to the other. Poirot's eyes followed this movement for a moment before drifting away as if it were of no importance. Julia Greaves appeared soon after, in a plain navy dress, her expression unreadable. She ate little, instead stirring her tea absently while her gaze wandered toward the windows. Every so often she glanced toward the empty chair at the head of the table, the one Evelyn must have occupied the morning before. Mr. and Mrs. Latham arrived together. Peter Latham's conversation with Colonel Dane was stilted, confined to small remarks about the weather, while Caroline cast quick glances toward Mademoiselle Duval, who had not yet appeared. When Mademoiselle Duval finally entered, she did so with a grace that seemed almost rehearsed, her gown a subdued gray this morning, as though morning had already dictated her attire. Her companion, Charles Everleigh, followed a step behind, his tie slightly askew, his eyes half lidded with what might have been fatigue or disinterest. Poirot spoke little during the meal, yet I knew he was taking in every detail. The way Charles poured coffee for himself but not for Sabine, the faint tightening of Alistair's jaw when Julia addressed him, the absence of any real conversation between the Lathams. When breakfast ended, Poirot rose with a faint smile and addressed the table. Mesdames, Messrs, I am here in capacity of a friend, as you know. But I am also, it is true, a seeker of truths. Small ones, large ones, the ones we keep even from ourselves. I will speak with each of you in turn, quite informally, so that I may better understand the atmosphere of this house. There is no cause for alarm. It is but the method of Hercule Poirot. Alistair Greaves looked faintly displeased, but said nothing. The others murmured assent, though Julia's eyes flickered with something that might have been caution. Poirot began his morning rounds with the household staff. Carson, the butler, was precise in his recollections. Miss Harcourt had been in good spirits at dinner, he said, though she had spoken little. The glass in the conservatory, he recalled, had not been brought from the dining room, but had been placed there earlier in the day by one of the maids, for Miss Evelyn's afternoon refreshment. In the kitchen, Poirot questioned Clara again. The girl seemed nervous, her hands twisting in her apron, but she confirmed that the conservatory door to the garden had been slightly open when she found Miss Harcourt. She had not, she insisted, seen anyone entering or leaving. By late morning, Poirot had arranged to take a turn through the gardens with Mrs. Markham. She pointed out the small gravel path leading from the conservatory to a side gate. The gate, she explained, was usually locked at night, but last night it had been found unlatched. Poirot bent to examine the gravel. "Many footprints," he murmured. "And yet, see here," Hastings, a patch less disturbed, as though someone walked with great care. And near the gate, one print deep in the rest. A pause, perhaps, to look back. We returned to the house, where Poirot took the morning room once more, this time under the guise of reading. From there, he could see the comings and goings in the main hall. Alistair left for the stables. Charles Everly paced near the library door before disappearing within. Mademoiselle Duval ascended the stairs slowly, pausing once as though in thought. At one point, Poirot leaned toward me and said, "Observe, mon ami, how the currents of this house flow. They think the tragedy is a fixed point, but it is a tide. Each person is being carried toward some hidden shore. I am only watching to see who resists and who goes willingly." Shortly before luncheon, Mrs. Markham joined us again, bringing with her a small box. Inside was a brooch, gold, set with a cluster of pearls. "This," she said, "was found on the carpet in the upstairs corridor outside Mademoiselle Duval's room this morning. I thought you might wish to see it." Poirot examined it closely, then glanced at the envelope in which he had placed a pearl earring from conservatory. Without a word, he set them side by side. They matched. "Madam," he said, "you are most correct. I wish to see this brooch's owner very much indeed. But not yet." He closed the box and slid it toward her. "Keep it safe, and say nothing of it to anyone." As the luncheon bell rang, Poirot rose. "We have enough, Hastings, to begin asking the questions that will unsettle the surface. You will see, the ripples will show us the shape of what lies beneath." He adjusted his cuffs, glanced once toward the grand staircase where the guests would soon descend, and murmured almost to himself, "Yes, today I begin to prod at the lies." Chapter 5. Initial interviews begin. Poirot chose the morning room for his first conversations, a space neither too formal nor too intimate. Sun lay in clean rectangles across the carpet, and the French doors of the terrace stood ajar, letting in a disciplined thread of autumn air. He arranged 2 chairs in angle, so that he and his subject would face not each other but the same patch of garden. "For the nerves," he murmured to me, "and for the eyes that wander when the mouth embroiders." Alistair Greaves was summoned first. He entered with the briskness of a man accustomed to interviews, shot his cuffs, and sat without waiting to be asked. Poirot, all courtesy, made a small business of straightening a cushion before he began. "Monsieur Greaves, last night you said you left the table once to speak with Carson about the port. This was when?" "Between courses," Greaves replied. "The game had just been cleared." Poirot tilted his head. "Ah, but Carson tells me he had already decanted the port before dinner. You asked him to, what was the phrase, bring up the other? The other what precisely?" Greaves blinked. "The other decanter. There are 2 in the cellar marked Harcourt. Evelyn preferred the 08. Exact, Poirot said amiably. "And where did this conversation occur?" "In the hall, just outside the dining room." "Not the cellar?" "No. I told him which bottle. He knows the key." Poirot's gaze strayed to the garden. "And you did not happen, in your step into the hall, to notice Miss Harcourt leaving the table?" Greaves hesitated. "Only a fraction. I did not." "Bon. And you have known Miss Harcourt from childhood, I think." "We were raised nearly as siblings," Greaves said, and a brittle pride entered his voice. "Whatever you are fishing at, Monsieur Poirot, she was strong as a horse. This heart failure is absurd." "Then we agree," Poirot said softly. He let the words hang, and in that small silence something in Greaves's posture slackened, anger, I thought, shading into worry. Poirot rose, offered his hand, and dismissed him with a warmth that seemed to unsettle more than soothe. When he had gone, Poirot murmured, "He lies, but not about the port. He lies about what his eyes saw." Julia Greaves came next, quiet as a thought. She chose a chair near the garden doors and sat with her hands folded, her gaze dropping once to the scuffed toe of her shoe. "Miss Greaves," Poirot began, You went to the library after Miss Harcourt left the dining room. Yes. And what book did you fetch? Her lips twitched, as if she knew it was a small trap and resented it. A volume of Rossetti's poems, the blue binding. Poirot reached to the desk behind him and lifted a slim book with a blue cover. This one. A faint color touched her cheeks. No, I left it in my room. Of course, Poirot said, setting the book down. You like Miss Harcourt? Her eyes, gray and steady, met his at last. She saved me. In what sense, mademoiselle? She took me in when my mother married Alistair. I was not easy. Evelyn understood discipline without cruelty. A pause, then a coolness returned to her tone. But I don't pretend we were close. She kept her distances. Poirot nodded. And you, did you know of any announcement she intended? Julia's gaze slid to the garden. No. She rose before he could dismiss her. Monsieur Poirot, am I a suspect? Everyone is, mademoiselle, until the truth removes him from the circle. She inclined her head as if accepting a well-earned rebuke and departed without another word. Pride and wounds, Poirot murmured after the door closed. They often traveled together. Mr. Peter Latham, the solicitor, entered like a marginal note come to life. Precise, narrow, tidy. He perchance would have preferred standing, but Poirot insisted he sit. Monsieur Latham, I would like the contours of Miss Harcourt's affairs. Latham adjusted his spectacles. In order, Monsieur Poirot. Miss Harcourt's fortune is secure and liquid. A portion invested conservatively, a smaller portion more aggressively under my oversight. Her was last altered 3 years ago. And yesterday? Poirot asked mildly. Latham's mouth thinned. She telephoned to request an appointment for Monday to discuss possibilities. We did not discuss specifics. Poirot let his eyes droop. And the notepad in the morning room, the impression that reads 10:45, bring it to me directly. See, is that your hand? Latham started, a dog-like flick of surprise. No, most certainly not. Then whose? I cannot say. I did not write there yesterday. Très bien. Your wife, she is impressionable. Latham drew himself up. Caroline is spirited, not foolish. Spirited, Poirot repeated, filing away the word with an almost audible click. Merci, monsieur. Caroline Latham tripped in as her husband exited, the air around her carrying a rustle of silk and an agitation barely disguised as cheerfulness. She talked before she sat. I'm simply beside myself, Monsieur Poirot. Evelyn was, well, she was formidable, wasn't she? Not the sort to be done in by anything. Poirot smiled. Formidable women are sometimes undone by the small. Tell me, madam, last night, between the fish course and the game, where were you? With Mr. Everleigh, mostly. He's frightfully amusing. And I did step out to the hall for a moment. I thought I heard someone call my name. And did you see Miss Harcourt? No, a flutter of lashes. But I saw Sabine crossing to the conservatory corridor. She looked, oh, I shouldn't say. You should, Poirot said, and there was velvet in the instruction. Frightened, Caroline whispered. Like a woman who'd remembered something dreadful. Thank you, madam. One more thing, pearls suit you? She blinked. Why, yes, I have a set, though I didn't wear them last night. None, Poirot said lightly. Another did. He bowed her out. Mademoiselle Sabine Duval entered composed and pale, the gray of her gown a deliberate softness. She sat with grace and folded her hands, so the bracelets did not clink. Mademoiselle, Poirot said gently, you have known Miss Harcourt since Paris. A fleeting smile, a guarded door. We met years ago, yes. She was exact even then. And last night you crossed toward the conservatory corridor. Why? Sabine's eyes lifted slowly. To find silence. The house was loud with English gaiety. You did not see Miss Harcourt there? No. Poirot leaned, almost confiding. This morning, a brooch with missing pearls was found outside your room. For the first time, something fractured in the poise. A fine line etched itself between Sabine's brows. It is mine, she said after a beat. I broke The class dressing for dinner. I must have dropped it later. Later, Poirot repeated, in the upstairs corridor, not the conservatory. No, she said, and now her stillness was that of a tightrope walker who does not look down. Were you close to Miss Harcourt? Sabine's smile returned, thinner. Close enough to quarrel, she said, surprising me. Women quarrel, Monsieur Poirot, when money and men intrude. Ah, Poirot breathed. And which intruded here? Both, she said, and rose without mission. I am tired. Poirot, let her go. We shall return to her, Hastings. There's a perfume of truth on her words, but also the powder theater. Charles Everly ambled in with the loose grace of youth. He hooked a thumb in his pocket, slouched into the chair, and flashed a smile that did not land. You smoke, Mr. Everly, Poirot observed. You step out when rooms are close. Guilty as charged, Everly said easily. I hardly knew Miss Harcourt, you know. Paris was Sabine's world. I'm merely company. You walked in the garden last night. Did you notice the side gate? Can't say I did. Did you notice the conservatory door? Ajar, perhaps? He hesitated. A heartbeat. No. Poirot's eyes dipped to the young man's cuffs. You wear velvet at dinner? Borrowed jacket, Everly said with a laugh. Sabine insisted I dress properly British. Not my usual style. Velvet brushes, ferns. Poirot murmured so softly I doubt Everly heard. Aloud he said, You are attentive to Madame Latham. It is kind to entertain the anxious. Everly's grin widened a shade too much. I'm a democrat in my kindness. Even democracies have borders, Poirot said, and dismissed him. Colonel Dane arrived last of the guests, bringing with him the draft of a club smoking room. He sat squarely, knees apart, hands on thighs. You were fond of Miss Harcourt? Poirot asked. Respected her, Dane said. She did not dither. You went to the library for a paper. Did you pass the morning room? I did. And did you perhaps write a note upon the pad? 10:45. Bring it to me directly. See? Certainly not, the colonel snapped. I do not write summonses like a shop girl. Poirot smiled. Then someone else plays the colonel with his initials. Dane's eyes narrowed. You mean C for Colonel? Or for Caroline? Or for Charles? Or for 100 Christian names? You see, mon Colonel, how tired the alphabet can make a man. He let the soldier go with a polite nod. When the door shut, I exhaled. Well, Poirot steepled his fingers. We have the lipstick on the glass, the pearl by the chaise, the brooch missing a twin, the footprints that stepped carefully and then paused at the gate. We have the notepad and the letter with command to burn, and a house where many left the table and few remember whom they saw. He rose, smoothing an imaginary crease. Now we pluck one string. Which? The string of money, he said, and the string of fear. He rang. Ask Mrs. Markham to join us. Essayez vous plate, he told the maid. Then to me, in a tone almost conversational. If Evelyn Harcourt intended to change her will, Hastings, someone in this house expected to lose. When people expect to lose, they grow very brave and very stupid. Mrs. Markham entered, composed but pale. Poirot offered her a chair and, with that peculiar mixture of kindness and exactness that is his alone, began to ask the questions that would, by evening, make the first fault lines widen. Chapter 6. The First False Lead. Mrs. Markham took the chair opposite Poirot with composure that seemed almost rehearsed. The sunlight from the tall windows caught the faint gleam of her brooch, a modest arrangement of jet beads that seemed chosen for its sobriety rather than display. She folded her hands, waiting for Poirot to speak. Madam, Poirot began gently, I am told that Miss Harcourt was contemplating an alteration to her will. You, perhaps, knew more than you admitted last night. Her eyes flickered. She mentioned it to me, yes, in confidence. I thought it was merely an impulse. Ah, but you are too intelligent to think that, Poirot said with a small smile. Miss Harcourt was not a woman of impulses. Did she say who would benefit? Mrs. Markham hesitated, then lowered her voice. She said she intended to leave a considerable sum to Julia. She felt guilty, Perhaps that Julia had little of her own. And who would lose? Poirot asked softly. Her fingers tightened on her lap. Alistair, naturally. He expected the house and a large portion of the estate to come to him. Then, madam, we see a motive in the abstract. But motive alone is not guilt. Mrs. Markham looked troubled. You think Alistair? I think nothing yet, Poirot interrupted. But I think it is possible that someone in this house feared the change enough to act swiftly. The question is, was it he or another? At that moment, there was a brisk knock and Carson the butler entered, carrying a silver tray with an envelope. This was just found, sir, in the library behind a row of books. One of the maids brought it to me. Poirot took the envelope, noting that it was addressed simply to Yates in an elegant, unfamiliar hand. Inside was a single folded sheet of heavy paper. In dark ink, the words leapt out. If you mean to ruin me, you will regret it before the night is done. There was no signature. Hastings, who had been leaning in, drew back with a low whistle. Well, there's our proof. Someone warned her outright. Poirot's eyes narrowed. Proof? Ah, mon ami, how quickly you leap. This is an unsigned threat. It tells us something, yes, but not the something you think. Still, it will serve. Oh, yes, it will serve. He rose and asked Mrs. Markham to remain while he sent for Alistair Greaves. The man entered with a touch of irritation in his manner, which only deepened when Poirot, without preamble, placed a letter on the table before him. Greaves read it, his brows drawing together. And you think I wrote this? Poirot's tone was mild. Do you deny it? Of course I deny it. My quarrels with Evelyn were direct. I didn't send cowardly notes. But you admit there were quarrels? Greaves shifted in his chair. We disagreed about the estate. She was too ready to change what had stood for years. And last night, you left the table briefly. More than one person noticed. To speak to Carson, yes. Ask him. I have, Poirot said, his voice light but precise. And yet, monsieur, your footprints, your boots, would leave a certain mark in gravel, would they not? Greaves's mouth thinned. I did not go to the conservatory. If you think I did, you're wrong. Poirot allowed the denial to settle in the air. We shall see. But for now, you may go. When Greaves had left, Hastings leaned forward eagerly. That letter's enough to put suspicion squarely on him. Threat, motive, opportunity. And all too perfect, Poirot said quietly, when the clues arranged themselves so conveniently. Hastings, I begin to suspect the arranger. By late afternoon, the rumor of the letter had seeped into the household despite Poirot's request for discretion. Whispers followed Alistair when he crossed the hall. Caroline Latham regarded him with bright-eyed interest, while Charles Everly made a show of avoiding him. Mademoiselle Duval, however, appeared more watchful than surprised. Poirot, seizing the moment, staged a small experiment. In the drawing-room, he accidentally left a letter on the side table and asked Carson to send in whichever guest happened to be nearby. That guest was Charles Everly, who strolled in with his usual insouciance until his eyes fell on the paper. He paused for a fraction too long before picking it up. Threatening letters now, Monsieur Poirot, he said with a laugh that was just a shade too loud. This place is turning into a penny dreadful. Poirot took the letter back without comment, but when Everly had gone, he murmured to me, Note, Hastings, the man who pretends curiosity but reveals knowledge. He spoke of threatening letters, plural, yet only one is known. It was nearing evening when Poirot decided to make his move. He invited Colonel Dane, Mr. Latham, and Mrs. Markham to the morning room, producing the letter once more. I have here a document which may belong to one of you, he said, placing it in the center of the table. The handwriting, do you recognize it? Latham leaned forward, frowning. It looks familiar, but I can't place it. Mrs. Markham shook her head. No. Colonel Dane glanced at it briefly. Looks like a woman's hand to me. Sloping, delicate. Poirot's gaze flickered. Indeed, that is most interesting, mon colonel, because you see, he paused, as if reconsidering, then folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket. No, not yet. The time is not right. When the others had gone, I could not contain my frustration. Poirot, you've got them dancing on strings. Why not tell him what you think? Because Hastings, this letter is bait. If I reveal my conclusions too soon, the fish will scatter. But if I let them think the hook is dull, then perhaps the one who set this in motion will tug upon the line themselves. That night, just before dinner, Poirot received his first reward. Clara, the maid, knocked at his door, looking pale. "I don't know if it's important, sir," she said, "but someone's been in the conservatory again. The cushions on the chaise were moved, and there's a matchbook on the table that wasn't there before." Poirot's eyes gleamed. "A matchbook, you say? From where?" "From the Savoy Hotel, sir." He turned to me with a smile that was more fox than cat. "Hastings, the false trail has been laid. Now we must follow it, to see whose footsteps we find at the end." Chapter 7, The Psychological Game. It was after breakfast the next morning that Poirot announced, with that air of careful casualness he affects when he is up to something, that he would like to see a few small details attended to before continuing the formal interviews. I knew at once he was moving from observation to provocation, the stage in his investigations where, without warning, people begin to say more than they intend. "Hastings," he said, as we lingered in the hall, "you will remain with me today? I shall require an audience as much as an assistant. It is good for the others to know you are listening. They forget themselves more easily when they imagine they are speaking only to me." His first target was Caroline Latham. He invited her to the drawing room for a word about handwriting. The Savoy matchbook lay on the table, as did the threatening letter to Evelyn. Poirot began with the most innocent air in the world. "Madam," the flourish of the ear, "do you not think it rather pretty? You, who have a delicate hand, would know." Caroline leaned forward, a blush of pleasure at the compliment. "It is unusual. Not mine, though. A little more slanted than my own." "And yet," Poirot murmured, "it is similar in proportion. Perhaps it is a habit of all those who attend the same finishing school." That struck home. Her gaze darted away, and she busied herself with adjusting the bracelet on her wrist. "I really wouldn't know." Then, too quickly, "Why are you asking me and not my husband?" Poirot smiled. "Because, madam, you are more observant." He let her go before she had time to retreat into complete defensiveness. As the door closed, he turned to me. "She knows the hand, but her fear is not for herself. It is the fear of one who recognizes the work of an ally." Next, he sought out Charles Everley. The young man lounged into the morning room with his usual air of having nothing better to do. Poirot, without offering him a seat, opened a matchbook and idly tapped on the table. "Monsieur Everley, you have friends at the Savoy?" Everley's expression flickered. "I've been there, sure. Who hasn't? You smoke these matches?" "Matches are matches," he said with a shrug, but there was a quickness to his answer that made me suspect he had rehearsed it. Poirot tapped the matchbook again, then closed it. "You were in the conservatory last night, after the death. That was a foolish risk." Everley straightened. "I wasn't." Poirot raised a hand, as if to wave away the denial. "None. I do not say you did harm. I say only that you were there. And the man who returns to the scene, Hastings, he is a man who cannot leave something alone." Everley's mouth opened, then shut. "I don't see what you're getting at." "Of course not," Poirot said sweetly, and dismissed him. By mid-morning, Poirot had decided to turn his attention to Alistair Greaves. This time, the provocation was direct. He placed the threatening letter on the desk between them and leaned back. "Monsieur Greaves, last night I was told you were seen near the conservatory door shortly before Miss Harcourt was found." Greaves's jaw tightened. "By whom?" Poirot did not answer. Instead, he lifted the letter. A strong hand wrote this. The loops are the loops of a man who does not fear confrontation. Greaves gave a short, humorless laugh. "If I wanted to threaten Evelyn, I'd have done it to her face." Poirot inclined his head. "Perhaps you did. But then, a written record, that is less deniable, is it not?" Greaves pushed back his chair with a scrape and left without a word. Poirot's last appointment of the morning was with Mademoiselle Duval. She arrived composed as ever, but when Poirot placed a broken brooch on the table beside the pearl earring, her lips pressed together. "Both belong to you, mademoiselle. he said gently. Yet one was found outside your room, the other beneath the chaise where Miss Harcourt died. A curious symmetry. I must have dropped it earlier in the day, she said evenly. Then you were in the conservatory? She hesitated, just a breath, but Poirot caught it. Briefly, I looked in to see if Evelyn was there. She was not. You are certain? Her eyes met his. Quite. When she had gone, Poirot stood by the window for a long moment. They all moved carefully now. Hastings, but each has left me a little thread. Soon we shall see which threads knot together. At luncheon, the atmosphere in the dining room was taut. Caroline chattered brightly to Charles Everley, who responded with detached amusement. Julia ate in silence, her eyes fixed on her plate. Alistair kept his attention on his wine, while Mademoiselle Duval spoke only to Mrs. Markham in low tones. Poirot, as serene as a cat in a dairy, passed the bread to Colonel Dane and remarked, "It is curious, mon Colonel, how a letter and sign can speak so loudly in a room." The Colonel looked at him sharply. "You found the writer, then?" Poirot smiled. "I have found reactions." That afternoon, he suggested a walk in the gardens, inviting the entire company. As we strolled toward the side gate, Poirot lingered near the gravel path where the careful footprints had been. "Observe," he said loudly enough for all to hear, "how the one who steps here does so without disturbing the stones. It is a trick or a habit." I caught the swift exchange of glances. Mademoiselle Duval toward Everley, Caroline toward Julia. Poirot said nothing more, but the bait had been set. That evening in our rooms he told me, "One will make a mistake soon. I have sown enough unease. The mind under pressure, Hastings, is like a room with too many doors. Sooner or later, one will open the wrong one." Chapter 8. A Secondary Mystery. The next morning, I was roused earlier than usual by a brisk knock at the door. Before I could speak, Carson entered, his usually impassive expression unsettled. "Beg pardon, sir, but there's been an incident. Monsieur Poirot is wanted in the study at once." Poirot, already immaculate in gray, gave me a glance that conveyed both mild annoyance at the interruption and the spark of interest that any development in a case brought him. "Come, Hastings. This may be the ripple we have been expecting." The Harcourt study was a dignified oak panel room, lined with shelves and heavy with the scent of old books and polished wood. Mrs. Markham stood near the writing desk, pale but composed. On the desk lay a drawer, removed entirely from its housing and set down as if in haste. Its contents, a neat sheaf of legal papers, had been disturbed. Several lay fanned across the blotter. "It was locked last night," Mrs. Markham said. "I came in just now to look for some letters of my own, and found the desk open, and this drawer removed." Poirot approached with the delicacy of a jeweler appraising a flawed gem. "And what precisely, madam, has been taken?" Her fingers twisted together. "The folder containing Evelyn's latest correspondence with Mr. Latham. It was here yesterday evening. I saw it when we were discussing her will." Latham himself had been sent for and arrived looking harassed. He confirmed that the folder contained letters outlining preliminary thought about changes to the will, notes in Evelyn's own hand, and a draft she had begun some weeks prior. That draft would have been very interesting to the person she meant to disinherit, Poirot observed softly. "And the person she meant to favor," I added. "Just so, Hastings," he agreed. The study's French windows stood slightly ajar. Poirot stooped, examining the latch. Not forced. And the gravel outside. Ah, here are our careful steps again. They come and go, in and out, like a cat that knows where the milk is kept. Mrs. Markham clasped her hands tighter. "This is intolerable. First Evelyn, now theft. It is as though the house itself conspires to hide the truth." Poirot's gaze swept the room. "It is not the house that conspires, madam. It is the people within it, and perhaps one person from without. The Savoy matchbook, remember." We began our questioning anew, summoning the household to the drawing-room. Each was asked where they had been that morning, and whether they had entered the study. Alistair Greaves declared he had been in the stables since dawn. "If you think I've stolen my cousin's papers, you're mad," he told Poirot bluntly. "They'll show nothing you don't already suspect." Julia Greaves said she had been in her room, writing letters. She met Poirot's gaze squarely when he asked if she had heard anyone in the corridor outside the study. "Only Mrs. Latham passing by," she replied. Caroline Latham, when confronted, fluttered indignantly. "I went into morning room for tea and then to the conservatory for some air. I didn't so much as glance at the study. Mademoiselle Duval claimed she had been walking in the garden. Charles Everley, for his part, announced he had been reading in the library, though I confess the titles here are heavy-going. Colonel Dane, the last to be asked, said he had been with Carson discussing the wine cellar. Carson corroborated this. When the formalities were over, Poirot did something unexpected. He invited them all to remain and spoke in a conversational tone. You see, MES Amos, this theft tells us two things. First, that the person responsible for Miss Harcourt's death feels the need to secure more information or to destroy it. Second, that they are not yet certain of their safety. This is excellent. Fear, you understand, will make them err again. The effect was immediate. Caroline Latham's color rose. Charles Everley gave a short laugh. Alistair shifted in his seat. Sabine Duval alone appeared serene, though I caught a brief flicker at her eyes when Poirot mentioned destruction of papers. After they dispersed, Poirot asked Mrs. Markham quietly if any of the servants had reason to enter the study. She shook her head. Only Carson and me. Evelyn kept it locked when she was away. Poirot then examined the desk more closely. In the corner of the drawer's interior, he found a tiny smear of something dark. He dabbed at it with a handkerchief, sniffed, and smiled faintly. Coffee, Hastings, and not this morning's brew. This was spilt, then dried, before being placed back in the desk. A curious souvenir to carry from a theft. It was just after luncheon when another piece fell into place. Or so I thought. Clara, the maid, looking both nervous and indignant, came to report that she found a crumpled sheet of paper in the conservatory waste bin. Poirot smoothed it out, a torn half of one of Evelyn's draft letters in her hand, referring to a matter of great importance she intended to finalize before Sunday. And the other half? I asked. Gone, Poirot said. Burned, perhaps, or pocketed. But someone was careless enough to leave this behind. Or, he glanced toward the door, clever enough to want it found. That evening, Poirot did not retire early as was his habit. Instead, he lingered in the library under pretense of reading. Around 10 o'clock, the door creaked open and Julia Greaves appeared. She started when she saw him. I couldn't sleep, she said. I came for a book. Poirot rose, handed her the very Rossetti volume she had mentioned before, and watched her retreat. When she was gone, he murmured, They begin to move at odd hours. The walls are pressing in. As we returned to our rooms, he told me quietly, This second crime is as instructive as the first. It shows us the desperation of our murderer, and desperation, Hastings, is the enemy of subtlety. They will err again soon. Chapter 9, Hidden Connections. The next day dawned low and gray, the sky a uniform sheet of pewter that seemed to press down upon Harcourt House. It was the sort of weather that dulled colors and sharpened tempers, and as Poirot noted with satisfaction over his morning chocolate, a sullen day, Hastings, is good for the truth. It strips the gaiety from the face. He began with a quiet word to Mrs. Markham in the morning room. Madam, you have known all these people for many years. You know their histories. Tell me, are there alliances within this house? Her eyes darkened. You mean, who is friendly with whom? Or unfriendly? Poirot said. She hesitated. Julia has never cared for Caroline Latham. I think she resents Caroline's vivacity. And Sabine and Charles are close. Too close, perhaps. Alistair dislikes Charles, though I cannot tell you why. As for Colonel Dane, he is friendly with no one except perhaps Alistair. And Evelyn was civil to all, yet she had a talent for knowing too much about people's affairs. Poirot inclined his head. You suggest that she may have had information best kept hidden? Yes, Mrs. Markham said quietly. And she was not above using it if she thought it necessary. After she had gone, Poirot and I moved to the library. He had arranged for Mr. Latham to join him there under pretense of discussing the missing correspondence. Tell me, monsieur, Poirot began, you've been Evelyn Harcourt's solicitor for some time. In such a role, one hears confidences. Latham adjusted his spectacles. Naturally, and those conferences are bound by professional secrecy. Poirot's expression was serene. But there is a secrecy and there is prudence. Evelyn, I think, may have shared some matters not with you but about you. Your investments, were they always satisfactory? Latham's mouth tightened. If you're implying impropriety. Non, Poirot soothed. But I understand that a sum was misdirected 2 years ago. Corrected, of course, but the fact of it might weigh heavily on one who feared a change of will. Latham did not answer. His silence was answer enough. From there, Poirot sought out Julia Greaves, finding her in the small salon where the morning light was kinder. Mademoiselle, you have the respect of your cousin Evelyn, yet I think you also had independence of spirit. Julia looked at him coolly. You mean I was not grateful enough? I mean, Poirot said gently, that you prefer to earn your own way, and thus resent her authority. And yet, if she had changed her will in your favor, I would not have killed her for it, Julia said sharply, nor for anything. Perhaps not, but you left the table not long after she did, and you told me you did not see her. That is true. It is true. Poirot did not press further, but after she left he said quietly to me, Her anger is real, Hastings, but so is her fear of something, not of murder, but of exposure. The afternoon brought an unexpected opening. Sabine Duval was in the conservatory. Seated precisely on the chaise where Evelyn had been found, a book open but unread in her lap, Poirot approached without preamble. Mademoiselle, the first time you came to England, you stayed with Evelyn, did you not? Yes. And you left suddenly after a quarrel? Sabine's gaze met his. You have spoken to Mrs. Markham. To many people, Poirot said. But the quarrel, it was about money, yes? Or about Charles Everleigh? Her lips curved faintly. Perhaps both. Evelyn was not fond of Charles. Yet Charles remained your companion. That requires loyalty. She laughed softly. Or necessity. Necessity? She leaned closer. Charles knows things. He has a gift for listening at the right doors. Poirot's eyes sharpened. About whom? Everyone, she said, and returned to her book. Later, Poirot contrived to walk with Charles on the terrace. You and Sabine are old friends, Poirot began. Charles grinned. You could say that. Paris has a way of making allies. Ah! But you also have a way of making enemies. Alistair Greaves, for example. That's mutual. He thinks I'm a parasite. I think he's a pompous old. Well, you know, Poirot tilted his head. And Miss Harcourt, what did she think? Charles's grin faded. She thought I was trouble, and maybe she was right. Enough to disinherit her friend Sabine for keeping her company? That, Charles said, would have been a mistake. And he walked away. It was in the quiet of late afternoon that Poirot shared his thoughts with me in the morning room. Hastings, the connections grow clearer. Caroline Latham fears for someone close to her, perhaps herself. Charles Everleigh is at the center of more resentments than I first thought. Sabine Duval's loyalty is tangled with dependence. Alistair stands to lose much. Julia stands to gain but fears some other consequence. And Monsieur Latham, he has his own shadows. Then you think all of them had reason? Poirot's eyes glinted. Exactment. And that is the danger for our murderer. In a house where all have motives, suspicion is a garment that can be tailored to fit any shape. The trick, mon ami, is to see whose garment has been altered twice. That evening, Poirot deliberately placed himself at the center of the drawing-room conversation, drawing each guest into exchanges that forced them to speak across old divisions. Remarks were sharper, glances more telling. When Alistair referred to certain people meddling in family affairs, Julia's hand stilled on her sewing. When Caroline laughed too loudly at something Charles said, Sabine's eyes grew icy. Poirot, serene amid the currents, sipped his tea. We are near Hastings, he murmured as W. Chapter 10, Poirot's Secret Clue. It was on the following morning, with the weather still heavy and the wind pressing damply against the windows, that Poirot made one of those quiet excursions about the house that, to the untrained eye, appeared almost idle. He moved with hands clasped neatly behind his back, pausing here to examine a picture frame, there to touch the edge of the side table, as though its varnish might whisper to him. "Hastings," he said as we reached the landing outside the guest rooms, "you will observe that in a case such as this, where the passions are so very domestic, the smallest of details may cry out more loudly than the greatest of gestures." He stopped suddenly outside Mademoiselle Duval's room. The door stood slightly ajar, and from within came the faint scent of her perfume, violets with something sharper beneath. Poirot did not enter, but his gaze swept the corridor floor. A small fragment of paper lay by the skirting board, lodged where the carpet met the wall. With a delicate pinch, Poirot retrieved it. It was no larger than a thumb, but across it ran the lower half of a printed word in bold capitals. "VOY." I glanced at it. "Savoy." Poirot's smile was slow and satisfied. "Just so, Hastings." A fragment of a matchbook cover, torn clean away, and our matchbook in conservatory, you will recall, was entirely intact until now. He slipped the scrap into his pocket without another word and continued down the corridor. In the library, he repeated the same slow sweep of the floor and furniture, pausing before the writing desk. There, lying atop a closed volume of memoirs, was a fountain pen. The nib was blotched with a faint trace of violet ink, and beside it, pressed into the leather blotter, was the ghost of a single word in Evelyn Harcourt's sharp hand: Caroline. Poirot bent over it for a long moment, then straightened. "You will say, Hastings, that a name is not a clue. But to me, it is the most dangerous kind of clue. It is a clue that someone meant to destroy and failed." Before I could ask more, Caroline Latham herself entered the library, startled to see us. "I was looking for my pen," she said, spotting it at once. Poirot handed it to her with perfect politeness. "It seems to have been misplaced here, madam." She flushed slightly, mumbled her thanks, and retreated, her fingers gripping the pen as though it might be wrenched from her. When she had gone, Poirot said quietly, "That is the second time her name has crossed Evelyn Harcourt's path in the last days of her life. Once in the note to see, and now here, abandoned but still visible." We went next to the conservatory, which Poirot insisted upon inspecting yet again. He had Carson bring him the cushions from the chaise, and he examined the seams minutely. In one, no larger than the nail of my little finger, he found a fine black thread, caught and knotted where it had been pulled free. From a man's jacket, Hastings velvet, I think, and we know one such jacket was worn the night of the dinner. "Everleigh's," I said at once. Poirot nodded. "The jacket, yes, but the wearer at the time? That is another question entirely." He would not elaborate, and I began to sense that the little Belgian was holding more in his mind than he was letting slip. The rest of the morning passed in a peculiar sort of stillness. Poirot kept his room for an hour, emerging only to have a quiet word with Carson, who was dispatched on some errand to the village. When Carson returned shortly after luncheon, he carried a brown envelope which he handed to Poirot. Inside were 2 slips of paper, both torn from the same hotel register. One bore the name Charles Everleigh, with the date of the dinner at Harcourt House. The other, in a hand only slightly disguised, read Sabine Duval. Both were entered for the same night at the Savoy. Poirot allowed himself the briefest of smiles. So they were in town together the evening before the death. And yet, Hastings, they told us they arrived from Paris only the day before the dinner. A small lie, but why? Lies of timing are rarely without purpose. That evening, while the household assembled in the drawing-room before dinner, Poirot took a seat by the fire and observed in silence. I noticed how his gaze lingered on the way Sabine and Everleigh avoided looking at one another directly, how Caroline's laughter came too quickly when Alistair made a rather flat remark, and how Julia's eyes flickered every time Evelyn's name was mentioned. When the others had drifted into their own small conversations, Poirot leaned toward me and spoke in a low voice. "You see, mon ami, how each is bound to another by threads they would prefer remain unseen. It is in these threads, not in the obvious quarrels, that the truth lies hidden. And today I have found the one knot that will not come undone." I pressed him to explain, but he only smiled. "Patience, Hastings. To speak it now would be to ruin the play before the last act. I will say only this. The scrap of paper, the ink name, the velvet thread, they are the chorus. The aria is yet to come." With that, he rose and, in his most genial voice, invited the company to join him the following evening in the drawing room for a little experiment. His eyes, as they moved over each face, were warm and unreadable. Yet I knew, with the certainty one has in long acquaintance, that Hercule Poirot had just set his trap. Chapter 11. Tensions Rise. The following day, the atmosphere in Harcourt House had changed subtly, as if the walls themselves were listening. Poirot's invitation to a little experiment that evening had traveled swiftly through the household, and with a current of unease that seemed to ripple in every corridor. Breakfast was a quiet affair. Spoons touched china too deliberately, and conversation never strayed far from the safe and banal. I could tell from the way Caroline Latham's hand trembled as she poured her tea that she was not immune to the tension. Alastair Greaves, on the other hand, made a show of reading the Times as though no one else in the room existed. Charles Everly appeared with a languid smile, but spent most of the meal glancing at Sabine Duval, who steadfastly avoided his eyes. Julia Greaves excused herself early, claiming letters to write. Poirot, as serene as ever, contented himself with buttering his toast and offering mild observations on the weather. Yet I could see the quick flicker of his eyes from one suspect to another, the way he lingered a second longer on every exchange of glance or word. After breakfast, the house seemed a fragment. Caroline and Sabine withdrew to the conservatory, ostensibly to admire the orchids. From the terrace, I saw them talking in low tones, Caroline leaning forward earnestly, while Sabine listened with stillness that suggested calculation more than sympathy. Alastair strode out toward the stables, but not before intercepting Julia in the hall. Their voices carried just enough for me to catch the tail end of the exchange. Alastair's terse, "You had better keep out of this," and Julia's cold, "Perhaps I should have done so from the start." Charles Everly spent most of the morning in the library, but when I passed the door, he was not reading. He stood by the writing desk, hands braced on its edge, staring down at the blotter as though willing it to speak. By luncheon, the strain was beginning to show. Caroline's usual bright chatter had gone brittle. Colonel Dane, who had been gruff but civil until now, suddenly accused Everly of loitering about like a bad penny in the study corridor the previous night. Everly shot back that Dane spent more time in the wine cellar than was good for him. It was the first outright exchange of hostilities I had seen between the guests, and it left a distinct chill in the room. Poirot, who had sat through the exchange with his hands neatly folded, finally spoke. "It is good, this honesty. When the air is close, one must open the windows. But also be careful of the draught." His mild tone did nothing to dispel the discomfort. In the afternoon, he asked me to walk with him through the gardens. The wind had freshened, stirring the branches and scattering the last of the autumn leaves along the gravel. "Do you feel it, Hastings?" he said as we strolled toward the side gate. "Feel what?" "The house. It is like a kettle that is very nearly boiling. The people within, they know something is coming. They feel the pressure, and when the steam escapes, it may scald." We paused by the gate, and Poirot crouched to examine the gravel again. These careful steps, they have been here again since yesterday. The same pattern of avoidance, of lightness. "You think the same person has been moving in and out?" I asked. Poirot straightened. "I think, Hastings, that whoever left these marks fears the eyes inside more than the eyes outside. And tonight we shall see them act or betray themselves." When we returned, raised voices from the morning room caught our attention. Caroline Latham's voice, high and tight, carried into the hall. "I'm telling you, it's not mine. I've never seen it before." Poirot stepped inside. Caroline stood rigid near the fireplace, her color high, while Julia held something small and metallic in her palm, a key. "This," Julia said evenly, "was found in the study this morning. Carson says it is the duplicate key to the desk drawer where Evelyn kept her papers." All eyes turned to Caroline. She took a breath, visibly forcing herself to calm. "I don't have the faintest idea how it got there. Anyone could have dropped it, or placed it," Julia said, and slipped the key into her pocket. Poirot's gaze moved between them. "Ladies, this is most interesting. The key, where exactly was it found?" "In the corner behind the desk," Julia replied. "Partially hidden by the curtain, Poirot nodded slowly. "Then it has been there for some days, which means, perhaps, that its presence was not for the opening of the desk, but suggests the opening of the desk. You see? A difference most subtle, but most important." Caroline gave a brittle laugh. "You mean someone planted it to make me look guilty?" "Exactment," Poirot said. "And if one plants such a seed, it is because they wish to see how quickly it will grow." The rest of the afternoon was marked by a strange civility. Groups formed and broke apart with uneasy regularity. Sabine lingered near Everly but spoke to him only in brief, curt phrases. Alistair and Colonel Dane spent a long while in the billiard room, emerging with expressions that suggested their conversation had been less about billiards and strategy. By the time evening fell, the house had the expectant hush of a theater before the curtain rises. The lamps were lit, the fire crackled in the drawing room, and the guests gathered with varying degrees of reluctance. Poirot took his place by the hearth, his hands resting lightly on the back of a chair. "Mesdames, Messieurs," he began, "I thank you for indulging me. Tonight, we shall conduct a small demonstration. It is not to accuse, but to illuminate. I will show you how the smallest thing, a word, a movement, may tell the truth even when the tongue does not." He looked around the room, his gaze warm but piercing. "And then, perhaps, the one among us who fears the truth most will find the room a little too warm." It was then that I saw it. The briefest flicker of movement from the corner of my eye. Sabine Duval's hand, resting on the arm of her chair, tightened on the fabric, her knuckles pale. It was the smallest of gestures, but in Poirot's eyes, I knew, it was as loud as a confession. He did not call attention to it. Not yet. The game, after all, was still in play. Chapter 12, The Confrontation. The fire in the drawing room hissed and shifted, sending shadows up the paneled walls. Poirot stood by the hearth as though he were the conductor of an orchestra waiting for the opening note. The guests, ranged in a loose semicircle of armchairs and sofas, tried to arrange their faces into polite interest, but every pair of eyes held the same question. Who would he turn first? "My friends," Poirot began, his voice smooth, "I have often said that to understand crime, one must first understand the criminal. And to understand the criminal, one must see them under a little pressure. Pressure reveals a flaw." He held up the fragment of matchbook paper with the letters VOI printed across it. "A small thing, found outside a lady's room. It tells us where the owner of this fragment has been." He let the silence grow. Then, without looking away from the group, he crossed to Mademoiselle Duval and placed the scrap on the small table beside her chair. "Mademoiselle, this belongs to you, does it not?" Her eyes lifted slowly. "I do not smoke," she said. "Non, you do not, but your companion does. And perhaps he had matches that were yours in name, though not in habit." Charles Everly gave a light laugh. "If you mean me, Poirot, I've never hidden that I've been to the Savoy." "What of it?" Poirot's gaze sharpened. "What of it, monsieur, is the date. You told us you came from Paris the day before the dinner. And yet you were in London that evening, at the Savoy, with Mademoiselle Duval." Sabine's shoulders stiffened, but she said nothing. "Why conceal this?" Poirot asked gently. Everly spread his hands. "Because it's no one's business. And Evelyn didn't like me. She'd have used it to stir trouble between Sabine and the rest of you." Poirot's eyes moved to Sabine. "And you, mademoiselle? You quarreled with Miss Harcourt over this very matter, did you not?" Her lips parted, then closed again. "She expressed her opinion," she said at last. "I told her it was mine to live with." Poirot inclined his head, as though conceding the point, then turned toward Caroline Latham. "And you, madam? How curious that Miss Harcourt's blotter should preserve your name. Twice in the days before her death, she wrote it, once in a note to C, and once on that blotter. What were you to bring her at 10:45? Caroline's eyes widened. "I never saw such a note. But you recognize the hand?" She hesitated. "Yes, it's Evelyn's. But I swear, Poirot, she never told me to bring her anything." "Perhaps she expected you to understand without words," Poirot murmured. "Or perhaps someone wished it to appear so." The room was tightening around itself. Alistair had set his paper aside. Julia was very still, her gaze darting from speaker to speaker. Colonel Dane sat like a carved figure, but his eyes were restless. Poirot let the tension coil before he struck again. He stepped toward Everly. The velvet thread found the cushion beneath Miss Harcourt's head. It came from the jacket you wore that night, a jacket that brushed the ferns in the conservatory. Yet when I asked, you told me you had not been there. Everly straightened. I wasn't. You were, Poirot said softly, but not alone. Sabine rose suddenly, her chair scraping the carpet. Enough of this. You are twisting everything into your own story. Non, mademoiselle, Poirot said, his voice low but cutting through the room like a blade. I am removing the twist to see the straight line beneath. And that line leads to the moment Miss Harcourt was found, a note in her hand, a glass before her, and someone very close bending over her, close enough to drop an earring, close enough to leave a thread. For the first time, Sabine's poise cracked. She gripped the back of her chair, her knuckles white. You think I think, Poirot said, that you have been protecting someone, and that protection is wearing thin. Everly spoke quickly. If you're implying... Poirot held up a hand. Monsieur, I imply nothing. I state only that between you share lies about your arrival, about your movements, and about the conservatory. And when one lies so often, one forgets which lie came first. The air was thick with unspoken words. Caroline shifted uncomfortably. Julia's lips were pressed into a thin line. Even Alistair, who had looked ready to dismiss all of it, now leaned forward. Poirot let the silence stretch a heartbeat longer, then smiled. Not warmly, but with the satisfaction of a chess player moving his queen into place. Tomorrow, MES Amos, I will invite you again to this room. And then, the line will be complete. Until then, I suggest you sleep well, if you can. He turned on his heel and left, leaving the guests in a silence that was louder than any argument. In the hall, I caught up with him. Poirot, you almost had them breaking just now. Why not push further? Because Hastings, he said, eyes glittering. A fruit plucked too soon is sour. Tonight, they will think, they will fret, they will whisper in corners. And one above all, will make the fatal mistake of trying to secure their safety. That is, when I will close the net. I glanced back toward the drawing room, where the low murmur of voices had begun again, sharper now, with metallic edge. It seemed to me the net was already drawing tight. Chapter 13. A desperate attempt to escape. The storm Poirot had promised began before dawn, not of wind or rain, but movement, furtive, hurried, and purposeful, in the corridors of Harcourt House. I had been half asleep when I heard it. The faint squeak of a floorboard, the muffled tread of slippered feet, a door closing with the care of one who prays not to be heard. By the time I was dressed in the hall, Poirot was already there, immaculate as ever, though with a look in his eye that told me he had been awake long before I heard anything. You heard it too, Hastings? Yes. Someone moving about. What are they after? He smiled thinly. We shall see, mon ami, but first we follow without haste. A hunter does not startle the prey until the net is ready. We moved toward the back staircase, where the sound had come from. The air was cool, and a faint draft crept along the passage, carrying with it a scent of damp earth. Poirot stopped at the foot of the stairs and pointed. On the runner, faint but visible, was a smudge of soil, and beside it a scattering of pale grit. Gravel from the garden path, he murmured. Our visitor has been outside recently. We followed the trail toward the conservatory. The door to it was ajar, and inside the air was heavy with the perfume of overwatered plants. The cushions on the chaise had been disturbed again, and on the wicker table lay the remains of something blackened. Small curls of paper, charred to the edge. Poirot bent close. They attempted to burn something here, but the flame failed to take completely. The ashes, they are too delicate to carry far. He lifted one with a fingertip. It is the corner of a page from Evelyn Harcourt's hand, I think, part of the missing correspondence. We turned at a sound behind us. Julia Greaves stood in the doorway, pale in her dressing gown. What are you doing here? She asked, her voice trembling. That, Poirot said, is the question I might put to you. mademoiselle. She flushed. I couldn't sleep. I came down for air. I didn't know anyone was here. Poirot regarded her for a long moment, then smiled faintly. Then perhaps you will be so good as to accompany us back to the morning room. By the time we reached it, others had appeared. Caroline, summoned by the sound of voices, Alistair, scowling as though woken unwillingly, and Sabine Duval, with Charles Everly close behind her. Colonel Dane was last to arrive, pulling a robe about his broad shoulders. Poirot addressed them all, his tone light, almost conversational. Someone has been busy in the early hours. Papers have been burned, or attempted to be. Someone wished to destroy a piece of evidence before tonight. Alistair gave a short, derisive laugh. If you're accusing one of us— I accuse no one yet, Poirot said, but I note that our nocturnal wanderer entered from the garden, bringing with him the gravel of the path, and that they sought the conservatory again. Sabine spoke for the first time, her voice sharp. Why must everything come back to that wretched room? You are making phantoms out of shadows. Phantoms, perhaps, Poirot said, but shadows require a body to cast them. The group began to fragment, Caroline whispering urgently to Julia, Everly pacing near the window, Alistair muttering to Dane. Poirot watched them with the calm of a man who knows the exact moment to intervene. Hastings, he murmured to me. It is as I thought. The pressure increases. Now we wait for the sound of the crack. It came sooner than expected. An hour later, Carson appeared at the morning room door, looking flustered. Monsieur Poirot, there's a motor car at the gate. The driver says he's here for Miss Duval. She's packing. The effect on the room was electric. Everly shot to his feet. Sabine, what the devil are you doing? She rose, her composure thinning. I will not stay here to be toyed with. This is not my country, not my fight. Poirot's voice was soft but firm. And yet, mademoiselle, it became your fight the moment you stepped into this house. If you leave now, it will be taken as an admission of guilt. I am not guilty, she flared, but I will not sit here while you turn everyone against me. Poirot stepped closer, his gaze fixed on hers. Then prove it. Remain until tonight, when all will be clear. Or run now, and let them say you fear the truth. The silence stretched. Sabine's hands trembled at her sides, then stilled. Very well, she said at last. I will stay, but I want this over with. When she had gone, Poirot turned to me with a quiet satisfaction. You see, Hastings? That was a desperate attempt. To flee before the net closed. Now she will remain, and tonight, when I draw the threads together, we shall see which one of them cannot bear the weight. I cannot tell if he truly believed Sabine guilty, or she was merely one more piece on the board he was maneuvering. But as I looked about the house that day, at the hushed conversations and the glances quickly averted, I knew one thing for certain. By the time evening came, Harcourt House would no longer be able to hold its secrets. Chapter 14. The final piece falls into place. The morning of Poirot's promise gathering dawned clear, the heavy skies finally broken, though the air still held a chill. It was a deceptive sort of brightness, one that seemed to sharpen every outline, leaving no room for soft edges. The house was quieter than I had ever known it, each guest moving with the subdued caution of a person aware that eyes might be on them at any moment. Poirot, of course, appeared entirely untroubled. He took his breakfast at a leisurely pace, discussing the arrangement of the marmalade pots with Carson, as though the day held no greater demands than the proper alignment of preserves. But I knew him too well to be fooled. Behind that calm lay a mind calculating each remaining move with the precision of a clockmaker. Hastings, he said, once we were alone, today I will have what I need. The last piece of the puzzle. It is there, in plain sight, waiting for me to pick it up, but I must lift it without the others realizing that my hand has moved. I followed him as he made his slow circuit of the house, pausing now and then to exchange a polite word with a guest or glance at an innocuous object. In the library, his eyes rested on the writing desk for only a moment before moving on. In the morning room, he studied the view into the garden as though considering the weather. It was only when we entered the study, still neat despite the earlier theft, that I saw him linger. On the blotter lay a small rectangular card, half tucked beneath a sheaf of household accounts. It was pale cream, the name embossed in black, Evelyn Harcourt. Poirot lifted it delicately, turning it so the light caught a faint smudge in the lower corner. Lipstick, Hastings, he murmured, a shade that our poor Mademoiselle Harcourt never wore. And this, he held it closer, is not new. It has been here, waiting for someone to retrieve it, since before her death. I frowned. But what does it mean? Poirot's eyes gleamed. It means, mon ami, that she received a message, perhaps written on the back of this very card, summoning her to conservatory, and that message was delivered by hand, from one woman to another. He slipped the card into an envelope and into his pocket before we moved on. Upstairs, in the corridor outside Sabine Duval's room. Poirot paused again, this time kneeling to examine a faint scratch low on the doorframe. A suitcase, he said, drag in haste. She would have had it carried if she had planned her departure calmly. But last night, that was flight, not travel. We descended to hall, where Carson was directing one of the maids in arranging fresh flowers. Poirot drew him aside for a quiet word, and the butler returned moments later with a small bundle, the half-charred remains of the paper from the conservatory table, carefully wrapped in linen. I took the liberty of retrieving it after you left yesterday, Carson said. It seemed important. Poirot thanked him gravely. In the morning room, he unwrapped the linen to reveal the blackened scraps. Using a magnifying glass, he examined each, occasionally aligning two fragments until a few words emerged in Evelyn's hand. Before they tell Alistair, not safe, bring it yourself. He looked up at me, his expression unreadable. Now we have the who, the where, and the when, Hastings. All that remains is to tell the others the why. The rest of the day, Poirot kept to himself, save for brief, seemingly inconsequential encounters with each guest. To Caroline, a passing remark about the color of her lipstick. To Everly, a casual observation about velvet jackets and their tendency to shed threads. To Julia, a question about her favorite poets. To Sabine, an inquiry as to whether she had ever enjoyed the gardens at night. These conversations, light as they seemed, left each of them a shade more unsettled than before. By tea time, I could feel the air in the drawing room tightening again, as if every person was silently rehearsing a defense against some unnamed charge. Just before dinner, I found Poirot in the library, standing by the window with his hands clasped behind his back. "It is ready, Hastings," he said without turning. "The pattern is complete. Tonight, I will show it to them, and to you. But I warn you, mon ami, it will not be pleasant. There is a cruelty in this crime that has nothing to do with the act itself, and everything to do with the mind behind it." At precisely 8 o'clock, he instructed Carson to inform the household that they were to gather in the drawing room immediately after the meal. "No excuses," he said, "and no absences." As we sat down to dinner, the tension was palpable. Forks scraped plates. Glasses were set down with more force than necessary. Caroline's laughter, when it came, was high and brittle. Julia barely touched her food. Everly toyed with his wine glass, while Sabine kept her gaze fixed on her plate. Alistair ate steadily, but the muscle in his jaw worked as if he were chewing more than meat. When the final course was cleared, Poirot rose, smoothing his waistcoat. "Mesdames, messieurs," he said pleasantly, "shall we adjourn?" And so, one by one, they filed into the drawing room, each carrying with them their own private dread. I followed, feeling the weight of the moment pressing in and wondering, not for the first time, if I was ready to hear what the little Belgian had pieced together. Poirot took his place by the hearth, the envelope containing Evelyn's card resting on the table beside him. "Now," he said softly, "we shall speak of the truth." Chapter 15, The Final Gathering. The drawing room that night felt different, not simply because all 8 guests were assembled within its walls, but because each seemed to carry their own private storm. The firelight threw long shadows across the paneled walls, catching the occasional glint from a button or a brooch. The lamps had been turned low at Poirot's request, their soft pools of light leaving the corners in the semi-gloom. He stood by the hearth, hands neatly folded over his waistcoat, his gaze moving from face to face as though he were taking attendance not of bodies, but of consciences. I took a seat off to one side, notebook in hand, feeling a peculiar mixture of anticipation and unease. "Mesdames, messieurs," Poirot began. "I thank you for coming. I will be brief, but I ask that you do not interrupt until I am finished. You may not like what you hear. That I regret, but truth is often an ungentle visitor." He allowed a beat of silence, then continued. "We are here to speak of the death of Miss Evelyn Harcourt and of the second crime, the theft of her private papers, which followed it. At first, these appear to be two separate acts. But they are not. They are part of the same plan, executed by the same hand, and motivated by the same fear." I noticed subtle movements around the room. Caroline Latham's fingers tightening on the arm of her chair, Alistair shifting his weight, Julia lowering her eyes. Sabine sat utterly still, but her gaze was fixed on Poirot with the intensity of someone bracing for a blow. "Let us recall," Poirot went on, "that Miss Harcourt intended to make an announcement. She had decided to change her will, and she meant to tell certain people before she did so. We know from Mrs. Markham that the principal beneficiary was to be Mademoiselle Julia Greaves. This meant, S. Amos, that others, some in this room, stood to lose much." He walked slowly toward the table beside him and took up the cream card I had seen earlier. This card, bearing Miss Harcourt's name, was found in her study. On its reverse was a brief message, now destroyed, but a faint trace of lipstick, of a shade Miss Harcourt did not wear, remained. "It is my belief that the card was used to summon her to the conservatory on the night of her death." He looked toward Caroline. "The lipstick matches yours, madam." Her eyes widened. "Are you saying I?" Poirot held up a hand. "Non, madam. I am saying only that you delivered the message. But you did so at the request of another, someone who told you it was a harmless errand, perhaps a note about flowers or a personal word. That is how you came to be used." Caroline sank back, color draining from her face. Poirot continued. "In the conservatory, Miss Harcourt was given a glass of wine. We know from the lipstick on its rim that someone else had drunk from it earlier, perhaps to mask any scent of tampering. The person who sat with her leaned close enough to drop a pearl earring and to leave a velvet thread caught in the cushion. That thread, as we discovered, matches the jacket worn that evening by Monsieur Charles Everley." Everley gave a quick, humorless laugh. "You're saying I was there?" "I am saying the jacket was there," Poirot replied. "It may have been worn by you, or it may have been lent to another, but it is the velvet sleeve that brushed the fern, and that velvet was part of the scene at the moment of death." A murmur went round the room, quickly silenced by Poirot's raised hand. The second crime, the theft of the papers, was not an afterthought. It was insurance. The thief took not only the draft of the will, but certain letters. These letters contained evidence of another matter, of financial impropriety involving investments, which Miss Harcourt had quietly discovered. This would have ruined the person's standing, and given her motive enough to ensure her silence forever. His gaze shifted to Peter Latham, whose normally precise features now appeared pinched. Latham opened his mouth, but Poirot pressed on. "We must also consider the Savoy matchbook. It was found in the conservatory the day after the death. We later learned that two of our guests, Mademoiselle Duval and Monsieur Everley, spent the night before the dinner at the Savoy, not arriving from Paris as they claimed. Why lie? Because they had met with someone there, someone who knew of Evelyn Harcourt's plans and who wished to coordinate a response." Poirot replaced the card on the table and looked around the circle. "All of these threads, MES Amos, lead back to a single pair of hands. Hands that arranged a meeting in the conservatory, that ensured the poisoned drink was taken, that rifled the desk for papers, that planted misleading evidence to implicate others. And tonight I shall name those hands." The air in the room had grown heavy, the fire's warmth now stifling. Julia Greaves had drawn back into her chair, her eyes shadowed. Caroline stared at the carpet. Sabine's stillness had taken on a taut, brittle quality. Poirot took a step back, his expression calm, almost gentle. "But not yet. For now. I will leave you to consider which of you will be able to look me in the eye when I speak the truth tomorrow morning." There was an audible exhale from someone in the room, whether of relief or dread. I could not tell. Poirot inclined his head, then turned toward the door. "Bonne nuit, MES Amos. Sleep well if you can." As we walked down the corridor to our rooms, I could hear the sudden burst of whispered voices behind us. too low to catch the words, but urgent in their rhythm. I turned to Poirot. "Why wait? You've got them cornered now." He smiled faintly. "Because, Hastings, the cornered animal may still bite. Tonight, they will talk. And in talking, one will make the slip I have been waiting for. Tomorrow, I will not only name the murderer, I will show them holding the weapon still in their hand." I felt a shiver despite the warm corridor. The game was almost over, but the most dangerous move was yet to be played. Chapter 16, The Reveal. The morning broke pale and cold, a thin mist clinging to the lawns of Harcourt House. Carson moved silently through the hall, carrying out Poirot's instructions with the precision of a man who understood that the day would be unlike any other. One by one, the guests were informed that Monsieur Poirot required their presence in the drawing-room at 10 o'clock sharp. When the appointed hour came, they filed in with varying degrees of reluctance. Caroline Latham clutched a lace handkerchief, her face drawn. Peter Latham's expression was set, his lips pressed into a hard line. Alastair Greaves entered stiff-backed, followed by Julia, who moved with the contained grace of someone determined to betray nothing. Sabine Duval glided to her seat, without looking at Charles Everly, who lounged in his chair with studied indifference. Colonel Dane stood near the mantel, arms folded, as though bracing for an unpleasant duty. Poirot waited until the door was closed and Carson had discreetly withdrawn. Then he stepped forward, his small frame radiating command. "Madame Messrs," he began, "today I will tell you the truth about the death of Miss Evelyn Harcourt. It is a truth woven from small things. Threads of velvet, a fragment paper, the mark of lipstick, the lie about a journey. Separately, these things are trivial. Together, they form a tapestry in which the figure of the murderer is clear." He moved slowly to the table, where a neat array of objects had been laid out. The fragment of the Savoy matchbook, the bent pearl earring, the velvet thread, the cream card, the charred scraps from the conservatory, and the duplicate desk key. "First," he said, holding up the matchbook fragment, "we have the proof that Mademoiselle Duval and Monsieur Everly were at the Savoy the night before the dinner here. Contrary to their story, they met with someone to discuss Miss Harcourt's intentions regarding her will. This meeting was the beginning of the plan." Sabine's lips tightened, but she said nothing. "Second," Poirot continued, "the cream card from Miss Harcourt's study. On the reverse, now destroyed, was a summons to meet in the conservatory. The lipstick trace tells us it was delivered by Madame Caroline Latham, though she did so innocently, believing the message harmless." Caroline's eyes dropped to her lap. In the conservatory, Miss Harcourt was offered a glass of wine. On that glass was lipstick not her own, and in the cushion where she reclined was a velvet thread from a dinner jacket, as well as a pearl earring. These belonged to Mademoiselle Duval. She was there, close enough to bend over the victim as the poison took effect. Sabine's stillness cracked. She drew in a sharp breath. "You think I poisoned her?" Poirot raised a hand. "Patience, mademoiselle. You were present. Yes, but the hand that placed the poison was not yours. You were the lure, the decoy. The true architect of the crime was another." He turned to Peter Latham. "The theft of the papers the next morning was not opportunistic. You, monsieur, removed them to conceal a financial irregularity which Miss Harcourt had discovered, an irregularity that would have ended your career. You were desperate to silence her, but you lacked the daring to act alone. Instead, you became an accomplice after the fact, removing the very evidence that tied you to her death." Latham's color rose, but he kept his jaw clenched. Poirot's voice softened, but his words struck like hammer blows. The true murderer knew that the planned change of the will would deprive them of a considerable inheritance. They also knew of the solicitor's misdeeds and used that knowledge to secure his cooperation in the theft. But the act of killing, that was personal. It was done by one who could look into Miss Harcourt's eyes and see not family, but an obstacle to be removed. He turned his gaze to Alastair Greaves. "It was you, monsieur." Alastair's face darkened. "That's a lie. I never—" Poirot cut him off with a quiet, inexorable tone. "You left the table that night, not to speak to Carson about the port, but to go to the conservatory. You met Sabine there, having arranged through the card, delivered by Caroline, that Evelyn would join you shortly. Sabine—" Thinking it only a conversation, remained while you poured the wine. The poison you used was quick, but not immediate. You left before the end, ensuring Sabine would be the last person seen with Evelyn, thus placing suspicion upon her. He picked up the duplicate key. You dropped this behind the desk curtain during the theft stage the next morning. It was meant to suggest that Caroline had taken the papers, an elegant misdirection. But it was your boots that left the careful, shallow prints in the gravel outside the study and the conservatory. You walk like a man trained to march, yet you try to tread lightly, and in doing so, you left a signature all your own. Alistair's hands curled into fists. You have no proof. On the contrary, Poirot said, his eyes gleaming. The charred scraps in the conservatory contain enough of Evelyn's handwriting to show that she intended to speak to Julia about the will that very night, before they tell Alistair. That was your fear, was it not? That she would act before you could stop her, and so you stopped her forever. The silence that followed was heavy, broken only by the faint ticking of the mantel clock. Alistair's gaze swept the room. Caroline's stricken face, Julia's wide eyes, the cold contempt in Colonel Dane's expression, before settling back on Poirot. You think you're clever, he said at last, his voice low, but you don't understand what it's like to watch someone squander what should be yours. She had no right. She had every right. Poirot interrupted, and that is why you will answer for what you have done. Murder is never the right of the aggrieved. It is only the refuge of the weak. Carson appeared at the door, having been summoned earlier by Poirot's instruction to the local inspector. 2 constables stepped inside. For a long moment, Alistair did not move. Then, with a sudden exhalation, he straightened, as though accepting the inevitable, and allowed himself to be escorted from the room. Poirot turned back to the others. There is nothing more to be done here, Amias Amos. Justice will take its course. But remember, his gaze swept the circle, truth is rarely hidden by grand lies. It is concealed by small omissions, by the little details one hopes no one will notice. That is why I noticed them. He gave a small bow, then stepped aside, signaling that the gathering was over. Outside, the mist had begun to lift from the lawns. The house, I thought, would never feel quite the same. Chapter 17, Outcome and Justice. The constable's footsteps echoed down the hall as they led Alistair Greaves away, their measured tread seeming to carry some of the tension out of the drawing-room with them. Yet the atmosphere they left behind was no less heavy, only different. Shock, shame, and a kind of stunned relief mingled in the expressions of those who remained. Julia sat rigid, her hands clasped so tightly that the knuckles blanched. Caroline Latham stared down at the lace handkerchief in her lap, twisting it over and over without appearing to notice. Sabine Duval had leaned back into her chair, eyes half closed, as though replaying every moment of the past week in the theater of her mind. Charles Everly stood by the window, looking out over the mist-softened lawns, his reflection a pale ghost in the glass. Poirot, on the other hand, moved with unhurried precision, collecting the objects from the table, the matchbook fragment, the pearl earring, the cream card, slipping each into a small leather case. There is no need for these to remain here, he murmured to me. They have served their purpose. And they are trophies, perhaps, for a mind that collects the details as another might collect stamps. Colonel Dane cleared his throat. You've got him, then that's the end of it. Poirot's eyes softened, but his voice remained firm. No, mon colonel, that is not the end. It is only the conclusion of the criminal matter. The end, for those who care for Miss Harcourt, is more difficult. There is grief to be borne, and perhaps guilt as well, for not seeing, for not asking, for not believing. Julia looked up sharply. I should have realized he hated the idea of her giving me anything, but I thought it was just words. Her voice faltered, then steadied. If I had insisted she'd tell me sooner. Mademoiselle, Poirot interrupted gently, do not let your mind walk forever in the garden of if only. Miss Harcourt made her own decisions. Alistair made his. You cannot carry both burdens. Caroline spoke next, her voice quiet but trembling. You said I delivered the note. I swear I never imagined. I know, madam, Poirot said. You acted in good faith. The deception was in the design, not in the delivery. That is why you must not dwell upon it. The one who used you will answer for that." Sabine's gaze lifted. "And me, Monsieur Poirot? What will they say of me? That you were entangled." Poirot replied simply, "That you lied to protect another. But you did not kill. Let that be enough." Everly turned from the window, his voice edged with something that might have been bitterness. "It won't matter. The whispers will be the same. People don't care about the fine distinctions between guilt and guiltless association." Poirot regarded him for a moment. "Perhaps not, monsieur, but you will know. And sometimes knowing is the only shield we are given." Carson entered quietly, informing us that the inspector had taken Alistair into custody and that the carriage was ready should anyone wish to leave for the station. No one moved. It was as though the house itself had conspired to hold its inhabitants for just a little longer, binding them together in the silent aftermath. Later, when the others had dispersed, I found Poirot in the conservatory, standing near the chaise where Evelyn Harcourt had died. The late morning light slanted through the glass, catching on the edges of the ferns and orchids, and dust motes drifted in the still air. "You know, Hastings," he said without turning, "it is a curious thing, how murder alters the spaces it touches. A room becomes not just a place, but a memory one cannot step into without feeling the weight of what happened there." I glanced around. "It will always feel different now." "Yes, and yet, in time, even this room will be reclaimed by life. New flowers will grow, new people will sit here, and the air will not carry the same shadows. Such is the way of things." We walked back toward the hall, our footsteps sounding unnaturally loud in the quiet. Outside, the mist had burned away to reveal the lawns in their full autumn color, the air brisk but clear. As we reached the front steps, a small motor car rolled up the drive, bringing a young constable with a message for Poirot. He read it, nodded once, and folded it into his pocket. "It is done," he said. "Alistair Greaves has confessed. The inspector will see to the formalities. Quick work." I remarked, "Not quick, Hastings, inevitable. Once the mind knows it has been fully seen, it often ceases to fight." We stood for a moment, watching the motor car depart, its wheels crunching over the gravel path. Poirot adjusted his hat, the crisp air stirring the edges of his mustache. "And so," he said, "we leave Harcourt House with the knowledge that justice at least has been served. But remember this, mon ami, justice is not the same as peace. That the living must make for themselves." As we drove away, I looked back at the house, its tall windows glinting in the pale sunlight. Behind them, the guests who remained would begin the slow work of mending, though some wounds, I thought, would never fully close. And beside me, Poirot sat in composed silence, his little gray cells already turning, perhaps, to the next puzzle fate might set before him. Chapter 18, the closing remark. The following morning, Harcourt House was a quieter place. The weight of the previous day's events seemed to have settled into the floorboards, muting every step. Outside, the lawns glistened under a thin frost, and the air carried that peculiar stillness that comes after a storm. Our departure was set for mid-morning. Carson, ever the model of discretion, had arranged for our cases to be brought down to the hall. Julia, pale but composed, was speaking with Mrs. Markham in a low voice by the window. Caroline Latham lingered near the fire, her hands wrapped tightly around a cup of tea, as if drawing warmth from it. Sabine Duval and Charles Everly were nowhere to be seen, perhaps preferring to avoid farewells altogether. Poirot, however, took his time. He walked through the rooms as though committing them to memory, pausing here to adjust the angle of a chair, there to straighten a picture frame. At last, he returned to the hall and stood for a moment, gazing up at the great staircase. "It is a fine house, Hastings," he said softly, "and yet, for all its elegance, it has suffered the same malady as the humblest dwelling, a poison introduced not by circumstance, but by the heart." Julia approached then, her voice steady but low. "Monsieur Poirot, I never thanked you for the truth." Poirot inclined his head. "Mademoiselle, the truth is often bitter at first taste, but it is the only remedy for the sickness of doubt. You will find, in time, that it is easier to bear than the weight of unanswered questions." "And Alistair?" she asked. He will answer to the law. As for the rest, his memory is yours to keep or to discard, as you choose. That, too, is part of justice." Mrs. Markham came forward then, her hands clasped. "You've given us clarity, Monsieur Poirot, though I fear we'll need time before we feel truly free of all this." Poirot's expression softened. "Time, madam, and kindness, to oneself as much as to others." We stepped out into the brisk air, the frost crunching beneath our feet as we made our way to the waiting car. The sky was a pale, crystalline blue, the kind that promises a colder night to follow. As the motor car began to roll down the long drive, I glanced back at Harcourt House. Its windows caught the morning light, gleaming with the same polite opacity they had shown us on our arrival. Behind them, life would continue, altered, but not ended. Poirot sat beside me in silence for some minutes, his gaze fixed on the road ahead. Then, as the gates came into view, he spoke in that reflective tone I had come to know so well. "You see, Hastings, the motives of murder are rarely as grand as the act itself. We imagine conspiracies, deep plots, elaborate feuds, yet so often it is a small, festering grievance that becomes a blade, a resentment nursed in quiet, a perceived slight, an inheritance altered. These are the seeds, and in the right, or rather the wrong soil, they grow swiftly." I nodded. Alistair couldn't bear the thought of losing what he believed was his. Exactment. He could not bear it, so he convinced himself he had the right to prevent it. That is the danger, Hastings, the moment when the mind stops seeing a wrong as wrong, because it serves the heart's desire. Then anything becomes permissible. We passed through the gates, the gravel crunching beneath the tires, and the house slipped from view behind a stand of bare trees. Poirot adjusted his cuffs and leaned back, a faint smile playing at the corners of his mouth. "But we must not dwell too long on darkness, mon ami. The case is closed, justice is in motion, and somewhere ahead, the world is already preparing another puzzle for us. And he tapped the side of his head, I have room yet for many more." The motor car picked up speed along the country road, and the chill of the morning air seemed to sharpen everything. The horizon, the fields, even the distant glint of the sun. Harcourt House was behind us, its secret spent, its silences spoken. And beside me, the little Belgian sat, already half turned toward the future, his mind a polished mirror reflecting the endless intricacies of human nature.